1 in every 5 high school students in the United States now uses a vape. And in the United Kingdom, about 7% of kids aged 11 to 17 report the same habit, a proportion that has nearly doubled in roughly 2 years. Among the young, vaping has overtaken traditional cigarettes, which flips the script many adults grew up with. That rise brings a blunt question that refuses to go away. With headlines about sudden lung injuries, candy shop flavors, and devices arriving faster than rules can catch them, is vaping actually worse than smoking? To even approach a fair answer, look at how the drug gets from a device into a brain. Vapes heat a liquid with a small coil that can reach temperatures ranging from just over 100 degrees Celsius to close to 1,000 degrees Celsius under certain conditions. That heat turns a carrier fluid, often propylene glycol or vegetable glycerin, into an aerosol that looks a lot like the fog that rolls across a concert stage. Mixed into that vapor is an active ingredient, most commonly nicotine, alongside flavoring chemicals that make the plume taste like dessert, fruit, mint, or anything a marketer thinks will sell. The aerosol arrives deep in the lungs and then into the bloodstream in a flash, which is why many studies find that nicotine from vaping can reach the brain faster or in higher spikes than nicotine from a typical cigarette. Patterns of use magnify this. People often take rapid, forceful draws on vapes, chain puffs in quick bursts, and keep a device within reach all day, which pushes total exposure up even when each puff looks small. Nicotine itself is not mild. Once it crosses the blood-brain barrier, it binds to specific receptors and sets off a fast cascade of signaling. Dopamine rises, attention sharpens, mood lifts, reaction time feels better, and muscles relax even while the mind becomes more alert. It is a curious duality, mentally energized and physically unknotted at the same time. And that contrast is one reason people return to it. The wave crests, though, and as the peak falls away, the brain begins to ask for more. Recent research suggests those cravings can show up within about 4 hours after the last hit for many users. And the urge can arrive far sooner for those who keep a device handy and dose frequently. Because many disposable and pod-based vapes use nicotine salts at high concentrations, the total nicotine delivered per session can exceed what most people absorb from a single cigarette, which makes the reinforcement loop stronger. Once nicotine is in the picture, the effects are not limited to mood and focus. Nicotine changes blood vessel tone and blood flow, and that has consequences for sexual function. Men who report daily vaping have been found to be more than twice as likely to describe erectile difficulties compared with men who have never vaped, even after accounting for other risk factors. The logic is straightforward. Constricted blood vessels and altered blood supply hinder performance. If a device delivers more nicotine overall than a typical pattern of cigarette use, then the risk, in theory, leans higher rather than lower. The scariest headlines of recent years centered on mysterious lung injuries. Emergency departments saw clusters of mostly young patients arrive with cough, chest pain, shortness of breath, and low oxygen levels. Some needed intensive care. Some died. Investigators eventually traced most of those cases to cannabis oils that had been adulterated with vitamin E acetate, a thickening agent that is harmless when swallowed or applied to skin, but dangerous when heated and inhaled into delicate air sacs. The pattern was labeled with an awkward name, electronic cigarette or vaping product use-associated lung injury. The overwhelming majority of those cases were tied to tetrahydrocannabinol cartridges from informal sources rather than nicotine devices, which matters because it shows that the greatest danger in that outbreak was not nicotine itself, but an unsafe additive and a supply chain that cut corners. Even so, the lesson is not a sigh of relief. The lesson is that chemistry matters, oversight matters, and lungs do not forgive mistakes. Flavoring chemicals drive the popularity of vapes, but the same compounds that make snacks taste like cinnamon, banana, or chocolate do not necessarily belong in heated aerosols. Consider the molecule that gives a cinnamon punch. In food, it is common. In a lung, it can impair tiny hair-like structures that help clear debris and pathogens. Other flavoring agents associated with chocolate and banana notes have been shown in cell and animal models to provoke inflammatory responses in airway tissues. A recent wave of lab studies has detected volatile organic compounds, including benzene under certain conditions, in vape emissions. Those are not flavors anyone wants. Beyond the liquid, the hardware itself contributes to what people breathe. Coils can shed metals such as manganese and zinc into the aerosol, and repeated exposure to metal-laced particles can injure the lining of the airways and reduce oxygen delivery in tissues. In animals exposed over time, researchers have observed changes in the lungs that look a lot like the early footprints of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a condition long tied to cigarette smoke that still kills a great many people every year. All of that sounds damning, and none of it is imaginary. Yet the comparison to cigarettes still needs to be made carefully, because the way smoke is produced by a burning tube of tobacco is a special kind of disaster. Combustion floods the lungs with tars, carbon monoxide, and a stew of carcinogens that carve scars into airways and destroy the tiny elastic sacs that exchange oxygen for life. Some pulmonologists have said that drawing on a cigarette is like placing your mouth over a tailpipe and taking a pull. That is not hyperbole. Across the world, roughly 1 in 8 people still smoke, a number that adds up to well over 1 billion individuals. And the toll in disease and death is counted in the millions every year. The danger of cigarettes has been documented across decades in every organ system from the mouth to the bladder, with cancer, emphysema, heart attacks, stroke, chronic bronchitis, and the kind of daily breathlessness that makes stairs feel like mountains. By contrast, vaping is younger, more localized to a handful of regions, especially parts of Europe, the United States, and China. An underactive study. That does not make it safe. It does mean the ledger of long-term harm is not as complete, and the picture is still being filled in year by year. One thing is already clear. Many teens and young adults who would not have picked up a cigarette are now experimenting with vapes, and a significant fraction slide from experimentation into daily use. When that happens, nicotine takes center stage. It rewires the reward circuitry, trains attention to wait for the next small jolt, and turns a device into a pocket routine that can shape an entire day. The chemistry of vaping complicates policy. The original idea was brutally simple: provide a cleaner, duller delivery of nicotine to help long-time smokers step down from combusted tobacco and eventually stop. A plain, technical device for quitting. Then flavor and convenience and sleek design arrived, and the market reached for growth. The result is a generation of products designed to be pleasant, easy to conceal, and satisfying to inhale. Some countries have tightened controls on flavors and marketing, while others race to keep up. Meanwhile, countless off-brand liquids pop up with ingredient lists that read like a small chemistry set. Few parents or teachers can decode the jargon. Few teens feel any urgency to try. The honest question people want answered still sits on the table. Which is worse? If the metric is global disease and death today, cigarettes remain the heavier weight by a wide margin. Combustion is a menace. The tar and gases it creates make a poison that decades of data have already judged. If the metric is acute overdose, vaping devices are less likely to kill outright. If the metric is what is happening right now in schools and youth culture, vaping is the faster-moving problem because it hooks new users who never would have smoked and introduces high-concentration nicotine to developing brains. This is where caution and clarity matter more than slogans. A nicotine-naive teenager with a sleek device and a pocket full of fruit cream pods is not making a small decision. They are enrolling their brain in a course on reinforcement and craving. An adult, lifelong smoker who switches completely from cigarettes to a regulated, low-risk vape with the plan to taper nicotine may be making a bridge to something better, provided the bridge is used to cross the river and not to build a new home in the middle of it. In between those extremes are millions of people bouncing between cigarettes and vapes, doubling exposure instead of reducing it, and millions more who keep a device at the ready from breakfast to bedtime, building a habit that is hard to see until it is hard to stop. No one should pretend there are no unknowns. Heating liquids to hundreds of degrees and inhaling the resulting aerosol every day for years is a modern experiment, and long-term outcomes take time to reveal themselves. What we do know is already enough to avoid romanticizing the habit. Flavoring agents that are safe to swallow are not automatically safe to inhale. Metal fragments and volatile compounds do not deserve a home in lungs. The same dopamine pulse that makes a study session feel easier can make stepping away feel impossible. Meanwhile, old problems have not gone away. Cigarettes continue to dominate the world's burden of nicotine-related disease, especially in countries where regulation is weak and addiction is widespread. There is a sober way through the noise. Keep devices away from young lungs. Be honest about nicotine's grip and the way high-concentration salts turn a quick curiosity into a routine. If someone you love still smokes, a tightly planned transition to a cleaner alternative with clear goals and a firm end date can be a step towards zero, not a permanent substitute. If you already vape and want your footing back, set boundaries that break the all-day pattern. No device at the desk, no device in the car, no device after dinner, and give your brain the space to reshuffle. If you are mixing cannabis cartridges from unknown sources, set that aside completely. The lesson from those lung injuries is that supply and composition matter as much as the method. This is not an argument for panic. It is an argument for clear-eyed choices. Nicotine can make hours feel bright, but it does not do your future any favors unless the plan is to leave it behind. Vaping may be less catastrophic than burning tobacco leaf, and at the same time more seductive and convenient, especially for the young. Those truths can exist together. The responsibility to act on them does not belong to a headline, a company, or a device. It belongs to anyone who breathes. If the first half laid out the science and the landscape, the second half is about what real decisions look like in kitchens, classrooms, and break rooms, and what choices bend the odds in your favor. Start with a device that seems harmless because it does not smell like smoke. Modern pods and disposables often use nicotine salts, a formulation that softens the throat hit so higher concentrations feel smooth. That comfort is not a favor to your future. It simply lets more nicotine slide in quietly. A small, brightly colored stick can hold enough dissolved nicotine to equal many packs of cigarettes. And because you can sip it anywhere, the boundary between occasional use and all-day dosing evaporates. The result is a brain learning to expect a steady trickle of stimulation, and a day punctuated by micro-withdrawals that nudge the hand back to the mouth every few minutes. What you inhale alongside the drug deserves equal attention. The base liquids that carry flavor and nicotine were built to make fog machines and to sweeten or thicken food. Inside the mouth and stomach, they are handled one way. Heated to hundreds of degrees and pulled into the deepest parts of the lungs, they behave differently. Tiny droplets strike the lining that protects your airways and the microscopic hairs that help clear dust and microbes. Some flavor molecules add extra insult by disrupting those defenses or provoking inflammation. A person may not feel that process while walking to class or scrolling a feed, but over thousands of puffs, the lungs keep score. Metal particles from coils, volatile compounds formed at high temperatures, and sticky residues from sweeteners are not dramatic the way a cough of dark smoker's phlegm can be. Yet the cumulative burden still matters. Those who argue that vaping is obviously harmless often point to the absence of ash, tar, and the signature smell of burned tobacco. They are right that removing combustion removes a large chunk of the danger. That does not erase the rest. You can be safer than a cigarette and still far from safe. The most honest description is that vaping creates a new risk profile. Fewer of the classic hazards of burning leaf, more of the modern hazards of aerosols and chemistry and relentless convenience. For an adult with a long history of smoking, a well-planned switch to a regulated vape as a short bridge to nothing at all can be a rational harm reduction step. For a teenager who never smoked, starting to vape is not a side grade. It is the opening scene of a new dependency with its own health costs. There is also the part no one sees, how nicotine loops into mood and attention. The first draws can seem like a fix for boredom and stress. Tasks feel less dull. Edges feel sanded down. Over time, the baseline shifts. What once felt like extra focus becomes the minimum needed to feel normal. Mornings begin edgy, afternoons sag without a top-up, evenings stretch only if you keep hitting the device. This is how dependence hides in plain sight. You do not notice the cage because it looks like relief. The people who break that cycle do not do it by accident. They give their brains quiet hours to unlearn the pattern. They keep devices out of reach during the hardest windows of the day. They replace the hand-to-mouth ritual with something that does not erase progress. And they accept that a few days of fog and irritability is the price of getting free. Talk about sex and sleep, because those are the human currencies that reveal truth faster than lab numbers. Nicotine constricts blood vessels and reshapes blood flow. That is a mechanical problem for arousal that no amount of willpower can fully overcome. And it shows up more often in people who use nicotine daily. Sleep degrades for quieter reasons. Late evening dosing keeps the nervous system nudged into alertness when it should be winding down. Many users do not connect a shallow night of rest to a last round of puffs on the couch. Yet the pattern is there. The next day is harder. The device promises help. The loop tightens. Better nights start with earlier cutoffs, longer gaps, and a willingness to ride out the urge instead of resetting the clock with one more pull. Consider the lungs again from an angle anyone can understand. The inside of airways is lined with cells that secrete fluid and move it along like a conveyor belt to carry away dust and microbes. Heat, particles, and certain flavors gum up that belt or slow the tiny hairs that push it, which means more debris lingers where it should not. In some people, the result is a nagging cough and occasional chest tightness that never earns a doctor's visit but never quite goes away. In others, especially with heavy use over years, you see measurable airflow changes and a vulnerability to bronchitis-like episodes that take longer to heal. None of that looks like the classic destruction caused by decades of cigarettes. it is still a real cost to breathing, exercise, and resilience. Second-hand exposure is less obvious than with cigarettes, but it is not an illusion. The mist that drifts from an exhale contains ultrafine particles, nicotine, and flavoring chemicals that settle on surfaces and stay suspended in the air for a while. Pets and children share that space whether or not they consent. A home that smells faintly of peach mint might still be a home where a toddler's lungs are sorting out foreign compounds hour after hour. The smart rule is to keep all aerosols out of shared indoor air and cars, not because it is polite, though it is, but because other people's health should not be the collateral damage of your habit. Zoom out from biology to culture. Cigarettes conquered the globe over generations, and the damage they cause is measured in cemeteries and clinics in every country on Earth. Vaping is newer and concentrated in fewer places, but it has moved quickly through youth networks that once resisted smoking. Flavors, sleek design, and the promise of odorless use were a perfect storm. Schools scrambled to respond, parents learned a new vocabulary. Laws tried to catch up and are still catching up. In that fluid environment, two mistakes repeat. The first is fatalism, assuming nothing can be done because everyone is doing it. The second is hysteria, shouting in a way that makes teenagers roll their eyes and inhale out of spite. Between those poles is the boring, effective work of setting expectations, telling the truth about risks without melodrama, separating out the lesser evil logic for adult smokers from the real dangers to first-time teen users, and making it harder for companies to design candy for lungs. Some myths deserve a clean exit. Vaping is not just water vapor. It is an aerosol that carries chemicals and ultrafine particles. Vaping is not a guaranteed gateway to cigarettes, but for a subset of young users, it lowers the barrier to trying combustible products later, especially in social settings. Switching back and forth between cigarettes and vapes does not cancel out harm, it stacks it. Quitting nicotine does not require superhuman willpower or a perfect week. It requires a plan, support, and the ability to forgive yourself for stumbles while you keep moving forward. If you need tools, licensed nicotine replacement in controlled doses can help taper in a way that ends the cycle rather than extending it. Behavioral support, counseling, text check-ins, or a friend who knows to ask doubles the odds of success. The finish line is not a mystery. It is just easier to see when you are walking with someone who has been there. There is practical triage for anyone not ready for zero. Set firm places and times when you do not vape, and defend them like appointments you cannot miss. Do not keep a device by the bed. Do not take it into the car. Do not reward every dip in focus with a hit. Gaps teach your brain that it can handle boredom and stress without a chemical cue. If you are determined to reduce harm while you work toward stopping, choose simpler liquids without a bakery's worth of flavors. Keep power settings low to avoid superheating, replace worn coils before they crumble, and skip cartridges from unknown sources entirely. Those are not endorsements of vaping. They are speed bumps to keep you safer on the way out. Parents and caregivers carry a different job. Curiosity and defiance are part of growing up. The goal is not to win a debate, but to keep the door open. Ask genuine questions. Listen for the reasons behind the habit: stress, fitting in, curiosity, the thrill of a secret. And answer those reasons as much as the behavior. Share the facts about dependence and sleep and performance without turning it into a sermon. Offer off-ramps that save face. Challenges that make a streak of substance-free days feel like an achievement rather than a punishment. Swaps replace a device with a gym hour or a hobby that gives the same little hit of mastery and calm. None of this is quick. It is effective. Now fold the comparison back together with clear eyes. Cigarettes remain the most destructive legal consumer product for human health, and the evidence is not close. Smoking pushes tar and a witch's brew of carcinogens into the lungs and poisons the blood with carbon monoxide. It shortens lives by years and steals breath day by day. Vaping, in a world where no one smoked and youth use was rare, might be a tool for a limited group of adult smokers to step down and step off nicotine entirely. That hypothetical world does not exist. In the world we have, millions of teens and young adults who never would have lit a cigarette now carry sleek devices that turn high-concentration nicotine into daily ritual. So the honest answer to the question of which is worse must hold two truths at once. Cigarettes cause broader, deeper, and deadlier harm. Vaping, though often less catastrophic than smoking leaf, is not harmless, carries its own set of risks, and is especially damaging when it recruits new users whose lungs and brains are still under construction. If you need a way to act on that knowledge, make it simple. If you do not use nicotine, do not start. If you vape and never smoked, set a date to stop, tell someone you trust, and make the first week easier by changing routines that trigger the urge. If you smoke, talk to a clinician about a short, tightly managed switch and a taper that ends with no nicotine at all, not a life sentence to a different device. If you sell or regulate these products, stop pretending that dessert menus belong in pods and that youth-friendly design is an accident. Health is not a slogan you print on a box. It is the absence of harm you build into the rules. There is no romance in dependence. There is relief in breathing deeply on a cold morning, in running without a stitch in your side, in sleeping through the night without waking for a dose, in concentrating for an hour without a chemical bribe. Those are the pleasures that last. The decision you make today is not about purity or shame. It is about the shape of your days and the strength of your future. If you carry that forward, the noise fades. You will not need to ask whether vaping is worse than cigarettes, because your own life will be answering a better question. What choice leaves you more free tomorrow than you were today? And you will already be on the side of that answer.